He called me worthless trash in front of everyone at the table, and my husband just sat there. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sent 3 messages the next morning that tore his reputation apart, without saying a single curse word. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. My name is Evelyn Grant, and I am 34 years old. I am a systems analyst by trade, a strategist by instinct, and a woman who once believed that marrying into a family meant being folded into its arms, not trampled under its shoes. The night it all snapped was a Friday, the kind where candles flicker too politely and wine flows just fast enough to loosen lips that should have stayed shut. We were seated around my in-laws' long oak dining table, the kind of table that looked like it had hosted 100 holidays and harbored 1,000 unspoken resentments. The roast was dry, the laughter hollow, and I knew from the second I walked in that something was simmering just beneath the surface. Walter, my husband's father, was the kind of man who dressed his cruelty in charm and always looked like he was waiting for someone to challenge him so he could crush them with a smile. He waited until dessert to do it. My fork was halfway to my mouth when he turned to me, lifted his wine glass, and said in a voice that rang like crystal, "I've never understood why you're even at this table. You contribute nothing, Evelyn. You're just worthless trash in a nice dress." For a moment, the air froze. My hands didn't move, but my heart went still. The room did what cowards do best. It went quiet, then moved on. Someone chuckled awkwardly. My mother-in-law sipped her wine with trembling lips. My husband looked at his plate like it was the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. No one stood up. No one said my name, least of all him. I looked at Walter, at the smugness tucked in the corners of his eyes, and something inside me cracked so silently, no one heard it but me. I finished my dessert without speaking, folded my napkin, and smiled as if the insult had passed through me like wind through glass. But I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream or shake or plead. I lay awake in bed beside the man who refused to defend me and started remembering things he and his father had long since forgotten. I didn't have power in that room, but I had something else. Receipts, patterns, leverage. I stared at the ceiling and thought, if they wanted silence, they chose the wrong woman to humiliate. It wasn't just that one night. It never island. What Walter said over dessert was only the culmination of 1,000 paper cuts he'd sliced into me over the years, each one small enough to be dismissed but deep enough to sting. When I first met him, I told myself he was just gruff, just old-fashioned, just one of those fathers who took time to warm up. But time passed and his warmth never came. Instead, there were comments disguised as jokes, the kind that landed with a thud in your chest. He'd call me the tech girl, like my job wasn't real, like years of analytics, deadlines, and boardroom presentations meant less than nothing to him. I remember one Thanksgiving when I brought a bottle of wine, and he held it up like a used napkin and asked, "Did your fancy job teach you that this is drinkable?" The others laughed, and I smiled then too, out of survival more than humor. Or the time I wore a new dress to his retirement party, and he looked me up and down and said, "Interesting choice, Evelyn. Bold. Not really your shape, but points for effort." That time, my husband squeezed my hand under the table, but said nothing. And when I told him later how it made me feel, he shrugged and said, "You know how my dad island." Yes, I did. I knew exactly how he was. He was the kind of man who believed a woman's worth was measured by her silence, her obedience, her ability to make herself smaller so his ego could breathe. And I was not that kind of woman. He hated that I didn't need his approval to exist. He hated that I saw through his bluster and recognized the insecurity pulsing beneath, but he never said it out loud, not until that night at the table. That night, he ripped the mask off and showed everyone the contempt he'd always reserved just for me. And they saw it. Every single one of them. I went to bed that night cataloging every slight, every sideways glance, every moment I swallowed my pride so I could keep the peace. I started sorting them in my mind like files. One labeled career jabs. One for body comments. One for moments my husband chose comfort over courage. I didn't know what I'd do with them yet, but I knew I was done pretending it didn't hurt. The ride home was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill space but stretches it, making every second feel longer than it should. I sat staring out the window, watching the glow of streetlights blur against the glass, pretending not to notice that my husband, Ethan, hadn't so much as looked at me since we stepped out of his parents' house. His hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering him to the moment, and I waited, giving him space to say something, anything, that might feel like an act of love or decency. But all he offered, finally, in a tone so limp it made my stomach turn, was, he didn't mean it, as if that would patch the wound. As if I'd misheard Walter call me worthless trash loud enough for the table to fall quiet and for his sister to gasp before pretending to check her phone. I turned to look at Ethan then, really look at him, and all I saw was a man shrinking inside his own skin, a boy hoping that if he stayed quiet long enough, the storm would pass without touching him. That was the moment it hit me, harder than Walter's insult ever could. I hadn't just married a man, I had married a silence, a practiced and rehearsed kind of stillness that let harm happen as long as it didn't ripple back to him. I thought back to all the times he'd asked me to let it go or be the bigger person when his family made their comments. I thought it was diplomacy. I told myself he was keeping the peace. But in that car, with the engine humming and my chest aching, I saw it for what it really was. Cowardice dressed up as neutrality. He wasn't protecting me, he was protecting his comfort. And I suddenly felt like I had been tricked into playing the supporting role in a play he was too afraid to rewrite. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just folded my hands in my lap and nodded slowly to myself, not in agreement with him, but in recognition of a truth I could no longer ignore. I had been waiting for him to stand up for me when the real question was why I kept choosing someone who sat down every time it mattered. What Walter never saw, or maybe chose not to see, was the version of me that existed long before I sat at his dinner table holding my breath, while he dismantled my dignity in front of a room full of people pretending not to hear. He didn't see the woman who spent her 20s working 3 jobs while coding at night in the back of a shared apartment where the ceiling leaked and the power went out every time someone ran the microwave. He didn't see the version of me who took a leap on a fledgling startup with no funding and turned it into a firm that landed its first $1 million client before the year was out. He never asked about the deals I negotiated, the teams I led, or the contracts I wrote from scratch after pulling all-nighters on hotel Wi-Fi with a laptop that groaned like it had lungs. He never asked because he didn't care. Because a woman who knew how to scale a platform, manage a team, and triple a company's valuation in under 2 years didn't fit into the outdated fantasy he had carved out for his son. He wanted polished silence in a pressed dress, a woman who laughed lightly at his jokes and agreed that women in business were pushing it. Instead, he got me. A woman who grew calluses instead of resentment, who smiled at boardrooms that talked over her, and then made sure she owned the table by the end of the quarter. But none of that mattered to Walter, because I didn't wear pearls or bake bread or lower my eyes when he entered the room. And so, in his mind, I was worthless. Not because I was weak or incapable, but because I refused to shrink. I remember the look he gave me when I once explained what I did for a living. His smile was the kind you give a child who's pretending to be a firefighter, amused but not impressed. That was the moment I knew he had already decided who I was, and nothing I said would change it. His ignorance of my work wasn't accidental. It was intentional, like tuning out a radio station you don't like because the music makes you uncomfortable. I wasn't the daughter-in-law he ordered, so he covered his ears and labeled me noise. But the irony is, I had already built the kind of life he believed only his son could provide me. And I didn't need his validation. I just wanted basic respect. That night at dinner, when he called me trash, he didn't realize the woman across from him was the one people called when their companies were on fire. I don't say this to boast. I say it because I have earned every inch of the ground I walk on. He just refused to look down and see it, but soon I was going to make sure he did. It came in quietly, like betrayal often does, cloaked in the ordinary hum of a Tuesday morning. I was scrolling through my phone between client calls when the message popped up from Becca, my husband's cousin, who had always played neutral but with the kind of neutrality that felt like hiding rather than integrity. I opened it without thought, expecting maybe a forwarded meme or some recipe from her latest low-carb obsession, but instead it was a screenshot, a chat thread. And my name was right there, caught mid-sentence, bracketed by laughter emojis, and a digital trail of mean-spirited delight. Walter had called me corporate baggage with a big mouth, and someone had replied with a gif of a dumpster fire. Another wrote, "He finally said what we've all been thinking." I sat there for a second, letting it wash over me like cold water poured too slowly. There was a moment where my thumb hovered over the delete button, the muscle memory of a woman taught not to make waves twitching, to erase it. But then something colder than hurt settled into my chest, a clarity that burned more than it stung. I took a screenshot of my own, not to retaliate, not yet, just to mark the moment. Because there's something sacred about knowing when the curtain finally falls and everyone stops pretending to clap. That thread wasn't just cruel, it was confirmation. All those awkward silences, the backhanded compliments about how driven I was, the jokes that sat a little too long in the air before someone nervously changed the subject, it was all there in plain text now. And suddenly, I wasn't imagining it. They had been laughing at me, around me, over me, for years. And in their glee, they forgot to be careful. They forgot that even the quiet ones keep receipts. I didn't reply to Becca. She must have realized the mistake quickly because the follow-up message came 10 minutes later, full of nervous apology and half-formed excuses about fat fingers and family drama. I didn't read the rest. I had seen enough. There is a strange peace that comes when people show you who they are so clearly that you stop needing them to explain it. That day, the ache inside me transformed into resolve. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just kept the screenshot and saved it to a folder I renamed Evidence. Because they thought they were making jokes. They didn't know they were drawing the blueprint for what came next. And if Walter thought calling me worthless in front of a table full of cowards was the height of his power, he was about to learn what it looks like when a woman with nothing left to prove finally stops asking for a seat and starts building the whole damn house. The first message was not written in anger. It was born from precision. The same kind of precision I had used for years to fix other people's messes behind closed doors. The kind that earned applause for someone else while I stayed in the background. Nodded at politely, forgotten quickly. But this time, I wasn't cleaning up. I was illuminating. I opened a new email draft and addressed it to Harold Denton, the man who co-founded Denton and Bryce with Walter back in the late 90s, before the scandals, before the lawsuits, before the brand became a cocktail party cautionary tale. Harold had always been the more measured one, the one who knew how to keep things off the record and out of the press, and I knew his respect for the company's legacy still lingered. I began the letter simply, with my name and my intent. I told him I was writing to clarify a history he may have only seen in fragments. I reminded him of the spring of 2021, when Denton and Bryce's client list was evaporating and their digital presence was one bad tweet away from collapse. I explained, gently but unmistakably, how Walter had asked me to quietly assess and restructure their online engagement strategy. I never got a title, never stood in a meeting, never appeared on a press release. But I was the one who rebranded their public narrative, rewrote their investor pitch decks, coached their comms director through crisis language, and I had the invoice trail to prove it. Every project file, every annotated slide, every receipt, I attached it all, not with malice, with precision. The subject line read, "Clarifying contributions." The tone was firm, but professional. There was no bitterness in my voice, only the kind of clarity that comes when you finally decide to tell the truth without waiting for someone to invite you to speak. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't speculate. I presented facts, plainly and without apology. And at the end, I thanked him. I thanked him for the time he took to read it, and for any consideration he might give it. I didn't say anything about Walter's comment. I didn't reference the dinner. I didn't even hint at personal offense. This was not a fight. It was a revelation. And as I hovered over the send button, I felt something shift. Not satisfaction exactly. Something steadier. Like placing a stone at the base of a foundation and knowing the weight is finally where it belongs. I clicked send. Then I closed the laptop. And in that silence, I knew the first message had landed not with fury, but with undeniable weight. The kind of truth you cannot laugh off. The kind that walks into a room long before you ever have to. The second message took longer to compose, not because it required more facts, but because it required restraint. There's a difference between revenge and revelation, and I wanted this to be the latter. I opened the archived article from 3 years ago, the one where Walter beamed from the front page of the local business magazine beside the headline, A Patriarch's Principles, Walter Bryce on Family, Faith, and the Future. I remembered the day it came out, how my mother had mailed me a copy, circled the phrase, unwavering respect for women, and written, look, he's finally evolving in the margin. I had laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I remembered the journalist too, a woman named Lila Tran, thoughtful and sharp, who had risen through the ranks with clean stories and careful sourcing. I knew her contact was still valid, so I crafted the message with precision. I never mentioned my name. I never hinted at the dinner. I simply said I had some background she may want to consider should she ever decide to revisit her earlier profile. Then I attached the screenshots. The one from the family group chat where Walter called me a leech and a parasite and everyone laughed. The one from an email where he forwarded my LinkedIn profile with the comment, "Can you believe she thinks this counts as a real job?" The one from a holiday card he sent to his clients in which every family member was mentioned by name except me. And finally, a recent text he sent to his golf buddy that I had seen over his shoulder once and memorized word for word before he deleted it. Connor's wife is a bit of a disappointment, but at least she stays quiet. I wrote nothing defamatory. I didn't accuse or editorialize. I let the evidence speak. I added a brief note at the end. Sometimes public image and private behavior do not align. Sometimes the loudest voices on values treat those closest to them with the least dignity. I thought you might want to know. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one. What mattered was the planting of a seed, the quiet suggestion that maybe the man she once quoted as a pillar of morality had a few cracks beneath the paint. I sent the message and closed my inbox. Not triumphantly. Not dramatically. Just with the kind of stillness that comes when you know you've told a truth someone else has been waiting to say. I stood by the window, coffee cooling in my hand, and watched the neighborhood come to life. Sprinklers chattering, dogs barking, children laughing on their way to school. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was the problem. I felt like I had finally started becoming the mirror they couldn't look away from. The final message was always going to be the one that mattered most, not because it held more weight, but because it looked forward instead of back. Walter had spent the last 6 months positioning himself for a seat on the Halcyon Venture Advisory Board, a role that would have placed him in charge of mentoring young entrepreneurs and influencing funding decisions for emerging startups. He had rehearsed the pitch in front of us more than once, at family gatherings and over holiday brunches, bragging about his legacy and leadership style, about how experience trumped emotion, and how the world needed more men like him guiding the next wave. I had smiled politely, listening to him speak as if he were the blueprint for success, when, in fact, he was the cautionary tale. The board's email had been easy to find, nestled in a press release with a direct contact for nominations and inquiries. I addressed my message formally, respectfully, professionally. I opened by acknowledging the board's stated values around inclusion, ethics, and mentorship. Then I explained that, while Walter Bryce presented well in public, his private behavior painted a far more troubling picture. I included a selection of emails, all verified, all time-stamped. One in which he referred to a female employee as hormonal and hysterical during a hiring review. One where he asked if I would be attending a company gala dressed appropriately this time. Another where he suggested women in tech were best kept in roles that require more typing than talking. I attached a transcript from a voicemail he left for my husband, angry that I had corrected him during a family dinner, ranting that I had forgotten my place, and was lucky to be tolerated. I made no wild accusations. I did not ask for retaliation. I simply requested, in neutral language, that the board pause and consider whether a deeper character review might be in order before finalizing appointments. I pressed send at exactly 6:03 a.m., while the sky was still soft and gray and the world had not yet decided what kind of day it would be. Then, I watched the sun rise. It crept slowly, like truth itself, unhurried and undeniable. I sat in the quiet, coffee in hand, and felt the hush that comes after a long-held breath has finally been released. Not relief, not vengeance, but clarity. It was never about destroying Walter. It was about illuminating the space he had occupied in shadows for too long, about forcing him to stand in the light and be seen for who he truly was. And maybe, just maybe, ensuring the next woman who crossed his path would not have to prove her worth just to exist near his ego. By noon, the phone calls had become a chorus, one I wasn't supposed to hear but did anyway, because panic has a way of echoing beyond intended walls. My husband's phone buzzed first, vibrating on the counter like it had something urgent to say. He glanced at the screen, hesitated, then answered with a stiff hello. I could hear her voice through the tinny speaker, urgent and trembling. Walter's assistant. She didn't even pretend to make small talk. She launched straight into it, her words piling over each other like a dam about to burst. "They're asking him to withdraw," she said. "From Halcyon. Someone forwarded them something. I don't know what it was, but they've seen enough." My husband looked at me as if he'd just realized I was capable of doing more than setting the dinner table. His mouth opened, then closed, the way a fish gasps when the water's been pulled from under it. I didn't say anything. I just kept washing the dishes, the sponge slow and deliberate in my hand, as if nothing had changed except the soap. But inside me, something unfurled. Not satisfaction exactly, but confirmation. A quiet alignment of cause and effect. Walter's phone, I imagined, was lit up like a Christmas tree dropped in a storm drain. I could picture him standing in his office, red-faced, gesturing wildly as if volume could rewrite reality. I knew his type. Men like him do not go down with dignity. They sputter, they deny, they threaten lawsuits, they never file. But behind closed doors, they plead. They bargain. They call in favors that have long since expired. And when all of that fails, they look for someone to blame. That someone had always been me, the outsider. The tech girl who didn't come from legacy, who didn't play the part of obedient daughter-in-law, who spoke in meetings and didn't flinch when dismissed. But this time, the silence that followed each ring was louder than his reputation. The board had seen the messages, the screenshots, the pattern. They hadn't needed a scandal to pull the plug. They just needed evidence that he was no longer an asset. The calls kept coming. One from a golf buddy who suddenly had questions. One from a sponsor who wanted clarity. One from a colleague who offered support that sounded suspiciously like distancing. My husband hung up and looked at me again, but this time with a strange mixture of awe and unease, like he'd just realized I was not the kind of woman you humiliate without consequence. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked past him without a word. In my chest, I carried no revenge, only resolve. The truth had been planted and watered, and now, finally, it was blooming. Not in headlines or hashtags, not yet, but in voicemails, in boardrooms, in the places Walter once thought he owned. He finally asked the question I had been waiting for, though I never expected him to speak it out loud. We were sitting in silence on the couch, the news on but muted, the soft flicker of headlines washing the room in artificial light. His phone buzzed on the coffee table again, another call from someone too nervous to leave a voicemail. He didn't reach for it this time. He turned to me, his voice low, almost cautious, like a man inching toward a cliff's edge without realizing he was already falling. "What did you do?" he asked, not accusing, not angry, just dazed. I didn't look away from the television as I answered. I reminded them who I am. He stared at me as though I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand, and in some ways, maybe I had. Because the version of me he'd chosen to love was the one who bent so she wouldn't break, the one who kept the peace at every family dinner, who nodded politely through condescension and smoothed over every insult like linen on a rumpled bed. He had never met this version, the one who documented, who strategized, who executed with the same precision I used to rebuild other people's failing companies. He blinked slowly, processing. "Was it you who sent the messages?" he asked, still half hoping I'd say no. I turned to face him, finally, and said nothing more. His face changed then, like he was watching a film flicker from romance to drama, unable to track how we got here. He looked at me the way someone looks at a fire they thought was just smoke. And I realized something right then, something bitter and freeing all at once. I didn't care if he saw me, not anymore. I had spent years trying to earn recognition from a family that mistook kindness for weakness, that mistook composure for compliance. And when that kindness was mocked, when that composure was trampled, I didn't scream or sob, I recalibrated. I wrote truth into paragraphs and stitched dignity into subject lines. He said nothing else. He just nodded slowly, eyes flickering toward the floor, as though he had finally grasped the depth of my silence and what it had been holding all this time. We sat there together, but I felt utterly alone, not in sadness, but in certainty. I had peeled off the mask of the version they had constructed for me, and in its place stood someone neither of them ever bothered to understand. I did not want revenge. I wanted recognition, not from them, but from myself. And I had given it, in full. The man beside me could not unhear what he now knew, but whether he ever truly saw me or not no longer held weight. Because I saw me, and I had made sure they did too. When the article finally dropped, it was like watching a carefully constructed house of cards collapse in slow motion, one flick of truth at a time. I was at my desk with a mug of chamomile and a quiet browser tab already open, the journalist having given me a polite heads up. The headline was sharp but not cruel, clinical but damning, behind the curtain of community icons. My name wasn't mentioned, not even hinted at, but the receipts were undeniable. Walter's quotes, taken directly from family messages and public statements, sat beside screenshots of him mocking the very values he claimed to uphold. The contrast was loud enough to echo. The article read like a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, slicing cleanly through his carefully manicured persona. It traced his history of championing traditional family respect while quietly humiliating the women around him. It referenced anonymous contributions detailing a pattern of belittling remarks, silencing tactics, and the systemic dismissal of women's achievements in both home and business. There were footnotes, evidence, careful sourcing, no rage, just truth. And somehow, that made it so much louder. I watched the group chats light up at first, then flicker out. There was no rebuttal, no bravado, not even an emoji. Walter didn't post his usual Sunday sermon quotes or link to his business blog. He was silent, and for a man who had always occupied space with the loud certainty of someone convinced they'd never be questioned, that silence was deafening. I checked his professional website later that evening. His upcoming speaking event was marked postponed due to scheduling changes. Comments under the article began to trickle in, women recognizing the behavior, some even quoting lines from the piece. A few guessed identities, but none landed near me. It was perfect, just as I wanted. I hadn't gone nuclear, I'd gone surgical, and that made all the difference. My inbox stayed quiet. No family apologies. No attempts to explain away the dinner. The same people who had laughed in that group chat had gone mute. It reminded me of a theater after a performance. Lights off, curtains drawn, where the actors quietly retreat from roles they can no longer defend. I didn't need them to call. I didn't need them to say my name. I just needed them to know they'd seen a version of me they never expected, and now could not unsee. There was a peace in that, a quiet, firm knowing. I folded my laptop closed and let the silence wrap around me like a well-earned exhale. They weren't laughing anymore, and I wasn't done. The phone buzzed twice before I saw his name on the screen, and for a moment I just stared at it. Walter. No dad, no pleasantry, just the cold, formal entry of a man who never saw me as family, and now had nowhere else to turn. I let it ring twice more before answering, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted him to feel, for just a few seconds, the hesitation he never once afforded me. His voice, when it came through, wasn't angry like I expected. It was tight, edged with panic, a man scrambling to catch a thread unraveling faster than his pride could stitch it back together. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the dinner, the comments, the messages. He didn't ask why the journalist had his quotes or how his business partner had gotten a hold of those invoices. He didn't even try to mask it as concern. It was blame, pure and simple. He spoke like a man wronged, as if the problem wasn't what he said, but that someone had finally paid attention. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I listened the way women are trained to listen when men are spiraling, with just enough silence to make them nervous, and not enough emotion to let them feel forgiven. He said I was making things worse. He said this was family business, and should never have been taken outside the house. He said my actions were disproportionate, that I was overreacting, that I didn't understand the damage I'd done. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, watching the steam rise from the tea I'd already let go cold, and when he finally paused to inhale, I exhaled, not in anger, in clarity, and then I hung up. No dramatics, no last word, just the soft click of a woman no longer interested in holding space for a man who had always erased her. 20 minutes later, I sent him a message. It wasn't long. It didn't have to be. I simply wrote, "If I'm so worthless, you shouldn't mind losing me." Then I blocked his number. Not because I feared what he'd say next, but because I'd already heard everything I ever needed to hear from him. The man who once spoke over me at every holiday, who called me trash with a napkin still in his lap, who watched my husband shrink into a boy with nothing to offer but silence, had just lost the one person he never thought would walk away, and he would never get the satisfaction of my voice again. Let him sit in that echo. Let him wonder if the next ring will be from another board, another journalist, another mirror held up to his rotting reflection. I owed him nothing, and from now on he would get exactly that. The message came in just after midnight, when the house was quiet and the world had finally stopped spinning. I saw her name on my phone and froze, thumb hovering in hesitation. My sister-in-law, Elise, the one who always smiled tightly at family dinners, who always changed the subject when Walter started one of his condescending tirades, who once squeezed my hand under the table but never said a word out loud. Her message was simple. "Thank you. I've been afraid of him my whole life." I read it twice, then 3 more times, letting the weight of her words settle in my chest like a stone that somehow made me feel lighter. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't spill details, just enough to say, "I saw what happened, and I'm grateful someone finally stood up." I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I suddenly realized that my quiet resistance had echoed farther than I expected. It wasn't just about me anymore. The story had cracked something deeper, older, something the whole family had tiptoed around for years. By morning, 2 more messages came in. One from a cousin who used to mimic Walter's sneers, now saying, "You were right to say nothing. That dinner was disgusting." Another from my husband's aunt, who wrote, "We all let him talk too long." They were ripples, soft and uncertain, but they were movement. And in a family that had mastered the art of silence, movement was revolution. At Sunday brunch, which I did not attend, I was told the energy shifted. Elise sat with her back straight, her eyes meeting Walter's directly for the first time in years. She asked a question he didn't like and didn't flinch when he answered with that old sharpness in his voice. Others noticed. No one laughed at his jokes that day. No one rushed to change the subject when things got uncomfortable. Someone even asked if I was okay. My name wasn't taboo anymore. It was a fault line. And the house built on his authority began to tremble. My husband, still quiet, still uncertain where his loyalties lie, watched it happen from the sidelines. I could see it in the way his texts got longer, more hesitant. He asked how I was sleeping. He asked if I wanted to talk. But not once did he apologize for staying seated when I was being humiliated at that dinner table. The divide didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a war. It was a gentle sorting. Who still needed his approval? Who feared his silence? Who wanted something better for the next generation? And somewhere in that shifting space, I stood quietly, unbothered, with no need to gloat. I hadn't burned the family. I'd simply lit a match in a room filled with dry wood. The smoke was theirs to name. The morning I signed the contract, the pen in my hand didn't feel like just plastic and ink. It felt like steel, like something forged from every moment I had been dismissed, overlooked, ridiculed. The client was a national brand, the kind of account that once would have been handed to someone with a louder voice and a flashier resume. But this time, it came to me. Word had spread. My name was now a quiet symbol of precision and results, and my portfolio spoke in numbers that silenced any lingering doubt. I walked out of that downtown office with the sun on my face, and a contract worth more than anything Walter had ever built with his outdated arrogance. That afternoon, I picked up the keys to my new apartment. It was nothing lavish, but it was mine. Light spilled through the tall windows and onto the hardwood floors, catching the edges of my ambition like a spotlight I no longer shied away from. I unpacked slowly, placing books with care, hanging art that made me feel powerful, surrounding myself with the calm I used to beg for in someone else's home. My wedding ring stayed in the velvet box in my sock drawer, untouched, unpolished, no longer heavy on my finger or my heart. I wore my silence like a silk scarf, elegant and purposeful. My husband had asked if I wanted to talk, but I didn't. I didn't want conversation. I wanted clarity, and I already had it. He had chosen comfort over courage, and now I was choosing me. Clients filled my calendar. Emails flooded in with subject lines that read, "Referral, heard about you, need your expertise." I had always been capable, always been sharp, but now the world was catching up to what I had known all along. Worthless trash. That phrase haunted me for a while. It rang in my ears during those first few nights alone, when the silence was thick and the hurt was fresh. But now, it made me laugh. Not bitterly, not with venom, but with a kind of soft triumph that only comes from surviving a storm and realizing your foundation never cracked. I did not need applause. I did not need validation from a table of people too afraid to speak truth. I needed my own damn table, and now I had one, polished and solid, with room for only those who respected the seat I had carved. Every invoice I sent was another stitch in the life I was rebuilding. Every strategy call was a reminder that I wasn't just surviving. I was succeeding. And the best part? I didn't need to explain that to anyone. Least of all to a man who mistook silence for weakness. Worthless trash doesn't sign national clients. Worthless trash doesn't negotiate retainers with six-figure confidence. Worthless trash doesn't walk away and build something better. I did. And I wasn't done yet. The night I hosted the dinner, the air buzzed with a quiet kind of reverence I had never known before. The clink of glasses, the warm laughter, the soft rustle of linen napkins, it all felt like a ceremony. Not for show, but for survival and emergence. I had chosen every detail with care, from the hand-thrown ceramic plates to the menu that read like a love letter to independence. The roast was perfectly pink, the wine deep and rich, the candlelight catching the edges of my guests' curiosity as they leaned in to ask for my thoughts, my advice, my opinion. The same voices that once stayed quiet when I was ridiculed now repeated my name with admiration, as if remembering too late that I had always been the one holding the thread that kept things from unraveling. There was no bitterness in the way I welcomed them, only boundaries. No apology, no forced smile, no need to perform. I was no longer the girl seated at someone else's table, hoping to be acknowledged. I was the woman at the head of her own, pouring wine into glasses that clinked not in celebration of tradition, but in respect of transformation. Walter was not invited. His name was not mentioned. But his absence sat in the empty space, at the far end of the table, colder than any insult he had ever thrown. It was the silence of consequence, the echo of what happens when you mistake someone's calm for complacency. I didn't need revenge to taste sweet. I needed peace to taste steady, and it did. My husband, well, ex-husband by then, had declined the invitation, perhaps knowing that the woman I had become no longer belonged to his world of excuses and silence. My sister-in-law came, though. She brought a bottle of champagne and an apology folded into her gaze. We didn't speak about the past much. We didn't have to. Her presence was a quiet acknowledgement, one that required no unraveling of history to be heard. As dessert was served a rich chocolate tart I had made from scratch. Just because I could, I caught my reflection in the window, not fragile, not furious, just full. Full of the self I had once buried under compromise. Full of a quiet dignity that no insult could ever tarnish. I raised my glass, not to toast, but to pause, to acknowledge the journey from insult to invitation, from mockery to mastery. The girl who once sat silent at a table where her worth was questioned had become the woman who built her own. And as I watched my guests enjoy what I had created, I felt it in my bones, not the sting of what had been lost, but the power of what I had built. A life where my name was spoken with respect. A space where I no longer needed anyone's permission to belong.